In the heart of a bustling city, surrounded by towering buildings and endless streams of people, stood the Grand Royal Palace. Its golden gates sparkled under the sunlight, drawing thousands of tourists from all over the world. Every day, crowds gathered to admire its beauty, take pictures, and catch a glimpse of the famous king's guards, who stood like statues outside the entrance. Among these guards was Corporal James Alden, a man known for his sharp posture, polished boots, and an expression so serious it could intimidate even the boldest of visitors. James had been part of the king's guard for nearly a decade. He took immense pride in his role, knowing that he wasn't just standing there to look impressive. He was protecting something far greater than himself. The monarchy, the traditions, and the history of the nation rested on the shoulders of men like him. But being a guard wasn't easy. It required discipline, patience, and the ability to remain completely still for hours at a time, no matter what happened around him. Every morning, James would arrive early, ensuring his uniform was spotless and his equipment perfectly aligned. His helmet gleamed, his gloves were immaculate, and his rifle rested firmly in his hands. Once he took his position, he became a living statue, unmoving and silent. Tourists often marveled at how he could stand so still for so long. Some whispered jokes about whether he was real or not, while others tried to test his limits by waving their hands in front of his face or making silly faces. But James never flinched. He had trained himself to block out distractions and focus solely on his duty. Despite the admiration many felt for the guards, not everyone treated them with respect. Some tourists saw them as props for their photos rather than human beings with feelings. They would crowd around James, jostling each other to get the best shot. Sometimes stepping too close or leaning against the barriers meant to keep people at a safe distance. Occasionally, someone would tap his shoulder or poke his helmet, laughing when he didn't respond. To James, these moments were frustrating, but he reminded himself that losing his temper would only reflect poorly on the institution he represented. What made things even harder was the sheer variety of personalities he encountered daily. There were families with curious children, excited couples on vacation, and groups of friends looking for fun. Most were harmless, but a few seemed determined to push boundaries. One day, a teenager shouted loudly right next to James' ear, trying to make him jump. Another time, a woman leaned so close to take a selfie that her hair brushed against his uniform. Each incident tested his patience, but James held firm, reminding himself that his job was bigger than any single moment of irritation. Still, deep down, James wondered if anyone truly understood the weight of his responsibility. Behind his stoic exterior lay a man who cared deeply about his role. He knew that every movement, every glance, and every reaction, or lack thereof, spoke volumes about the values he upheld. And though he rarely showed it, there were times when he wished people would see him not just as a symbol, but as a person doing his best to serve with honor. Little did James know, however, that his patience would soon be put to the ultimate test. As the days went by, more and more tourists began to challenge the unspoken rules of engagement with the king's guards. What started as harmless curiosity slowly turned into outright disrespect, forcing James to confront emotions he had long kept buried. Unbeknownst to him, these encounters would lead to moments where his legendary composure would crack, and the world would witness the fiery spirit hidden beneath the calm exterior of the king's guard. It was another busy afternoon at the royal palace, and Corporal James Alden stood tall in his usual spot near the grand entrance. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the scene. Tourists milled about, snapping photos, chatting excitedly, and marveling at the intricate architecture of the palace. For James, this was just another day on duty, but little did he know that today would mark the first crack in his otherwise unshakable composure. As the crowd swelled, a group of teenagers approached, their laughter ringing out louder than the rest. They were loud, energetic, and clearly thrilled to be there. At first, they seemed harmless enough, pointing at James and whispering among themselves. One of them even said, "Wow, look at him. He's not moving at all." Another replied, "Bet you can't make him flinch." What started as innocent curiosity quickly turned into something more mischievous. One of the boys stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with mischief. He reached out and poked James' helmet, not once, but repeatedly. Each tap echoed faintly against the metal, drawing snickers from his friends. Then another teenager joined in, holding up a phone mere inches from James' face to take a selfie. The camera flash went off multiple times, momentarily blinding him, though he didn't dare blink or move. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, the only sign of his growing frustration. James had trained for years to maintain his stoic demeanor no matter what happened. He reminded himself that reacting would only encourage them further. But inside, his patience was wearing thin. These weren't curious children or respectful visitors. These were teens deliberately testing his limits. And yet, protocol demanded that he remain silent and still. So he stood there, enduring the incessant poking and flashing lights, his mind racing with thoughts of how much longer he could hold on. The final straw came when one of the boys leaned in too close, practically pressing his nose against James' visor. "Hey, dude," the boy said with a smirk. "You're like a real-life robot, huh? Can you even hear me?" His friends burst into laughter, egging him on. James felt a muscle twitch in his cheek, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough to make the group cheer. He moved. "I saw it," one of them shouted triumphantly. Though James managed to keep his voice silent, the tension within him was palpable. He clenched his fists around his rifle, his knuckles turning white beneath his gloves. For a brief moment, he imagined shouting at them to step back and show some respect. But instead, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He reminded himself that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. It might even embarrass the institution he represented. Still, the experience left a mark on him. When the group finally wandered off, laughing and boasting about their victory, James exhaled slowly, allowing himself a moment of relief. He glanced around at the other guards nearby, wondering if they had noticed his struggle. If they had, none of them showed it. They, too, remained statuesque, their expressions unreadable. That evening, as James reflected on the day's events, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the annoying behavior of those teenagers. It was the realization that maintaining his composure was becoming harder than ever before. He had always prided himself on being unflappable, but now he wondered, how much more could he endure without breaking? Little did James know, this encounter was only the beginning. Over the coming days, weeks, and months, he would face countless other challenges from tourists who either didn't understand or simply didn't care about the boundaries they were crossing. Each incident would test him in new ways, pushing him closer to the edge. But for now, he resolved to stay strong, reminding himself of the honor and responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. After all, he was more than just a guard. He was a symbol of tradition, discipline, and resilience. And symbols, no matter how tested, were not meant to break easily. The next week brought a crisp morning to the palace grounds, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees and the faint hum of chatter filling the air. Corporal James Alden stood in his usual position, his posture as impeccable as ever. The early hours were often quieter, giving him a brief respite from the chaos that typically unfolded later in the day. But today, that calm would be short-lived. As the sun climbed higher, families began streaming in, their excitement palpable. Children tugged at their parents' hands, pointing at the towering palace gates and the guards standing like sentinels beside them. Among the crowd was a small boy, no older than 5, clutching a melting ice cream cone in one hand and dragging his mother's arm with the other. His wide eyes sparkled with curiosity as he stared up at James, clearly fascinated by the towering figure in red and gold. At first, the boy simply stood there, tilting his head as if trying to figure out whether James was real or not. Then, emboldened by his wonder, he took a step closer. James didn't move, though he noticed the child inching nearer. The boy's mother, distracted by her phone, barely paid attention as her son broke free and toddled toward the barrier separating the tourists from the guards. Before anyone could react, the little boy had ducked under the rope and waddled straight up to James. He stopped just inches away, staring up at the towering guard with an expression of pure awe. For a moment, it seemed harmless, just a curious child exploring the world around him. But then, the unthinkable happened. The boy reached out with sticky fingers and grabbed hold of James' ceremonial sword, which hung prominently at his side. At first, it was a tentative touch, but when the boy realized the guard wasn't moving, he grew bolder. With both hands, he wrapped his tiny grip around the hilt and began tugging insistently, giggling as if it were some kind of game. James felt a surge of panic rise within him. The sword wasn't just a decorative piece. It was a symbol of authority, history, and tradition. And now, it was being treated like a playground toy by a child covered in chocolate ice cream. He glanced toward the boy's parents, hoping they'd intervene, but they were too busy scrolling through their phones to notice what was happening. For several long seconds, James wrestled with himself internally. Protocol dictated that he remain still and silent, but this situation was spiraling out of control. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he shifted slightly, lowering his gaze to meet the boy's eyes. In a firm yet measured tone, he said, "Young man, please let go of the sword." The boy froze, his giggles fading into silence. For a moment, it seemed like he might obey, but then, to James' horror, he leaned forward and pressed his tongue against the cold metal of the hilt. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby crowd as people realized what had just happened. Some stifled laughter, while others looked genuinely mortified. James felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Never in his years of service had he encountered something so absurd. He locked eyes with the boy's parents, who finally looked up from their phones. Instead of apologizing, they chuckled nervously and said, "Oh, kids will be kids." Their nonchalant attitude only fueled James' frustration, though he desperately wanted to shout, "Do you have any idea how disrespectful that is?" He bit his tongue. Losing his temper in front of a crowd wouldn't help the situation. It would only escalate things further. So, with every ounce of self-control he possessed, he gently guided the boy back toward his parents, ensuring the sword remained firmly attached to his belt. As the family walked away, laughing off the incident as if it were nothing more than a funny story to share later, James exhaled deeply. He resisted the urge to wipe down the hilt of his sword right then and there, knowing it would break protocol. Instead, he reminded himself that moments like these came with the job. Not everyone understood the significance of the uniform or the traditions it represented. Still, as the day wore on, James couldn't shake the image of that sticky fingerprint and the lingering taste of defeat. It was a stark reminder that patience wasn't just a virtue for a king's guard. It was a necessity. But deep down, he wondered how many more incidents like this he could endure before his resolve began to crack. It was one of those chaotic afternoons when the palace grounds were packed with tourists, all eager to capture memories of their visit. The line of King's guards stood tall and motionless, a stark contrast to the bustling energy around them. Corporal James Alden was stationed near the center, his presence commanding yet calm. Despite the noise and commotion, he remained focused, his eyes fixed ahead, as if nothing could disturb his concentration. But today, the crowd seemed particularly restless. A large group of visitors had gathered nearby, jostling for space to take photos. Among them was a man in his late 20s, dressed casually in a bright Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops. He carried an oversized camera slung around his neck and appeared determined to get the perfect shot. As he moved closer to James, it became clear that he wasn't paying much attention to where he was stepping or how close he was getting. The man positioned himself directly in front of James, adjusting his camera settings while muttering to himself about lighting and angles. Without warning, he leaned forward abruptly, nearly bumping into James' rifle. Startled but disciplined, James shifted slightly to avoid contact, but the movement caused his weapon to slip ever so slightly from its precise position. It was a minor adjustment, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but for James, it felt monumental. His entire stance relied on perfection, and even the smallest disruption threw him off balance. The man, oblivious to what had just happened, laughed nervously and said, "Oops, my bad." His tone was light, almost dismissive, as though brushing off the incident as no big deal. But to James, those 3 words carried a weight far greater than the man intended. Here was someone treating his role, not just as a guard, but as a representative of tradition and discipline. As if it were trivial, something easily brushed aside with a casual apology. James felt a flicker of irritation spark inside him. He clenched his jaw tightly, his fingers gripping the rifle with renewed determination. For years, he had trained himself to remain composed under any circumstance, but this moment tested his resolve like never before. The man's carelessness wasn't just annoying. It felt disrespectful, as though his hard work and dedication meant nothing. Unable to contain his frustration any longer, James barked out sharply, "Sir, please step back immediately." His voice cut through the chatter of the crowd like a knife, startling everyone within earshot. The man froze mid-laugh, his expression shifting from amusement to shock. Tourists turned to look, some whispering among themselves, while others quickly snapped photos, capturing the rare moment when a king's guard broke his silence. For a brief second, there was complete silence. Then, applause erupted from the crowd. People cheered and clapped, clearly impressed by James' bold response. Some even nodded approvingly, as if silently thanking him for standing up for himself and for the dignity of his role. The man in the Hawaiian shirt looked embarrassed, mumbling another quick apology before retreating into the crowd. As the commotion settled, James returned to his original position, his composure restored. Though his outburst had been brief, it left a lasting impression, not just on the crowd, but on James himself. For the first time in a long while, he realized that asserting himself didn't diminish his authority, it reinforced it. Still, as the day continued, James couldn't help but reflect on the incident. He knew that moments like these would keep coming, each one testing his patience and resolve. But deep down, he also knew that he couldn't, and wouldn't, let people treat his role with such disregard. Being a king's guard wasn't just about standing still. It was about protecting respect for the monarchy, for tradition, and for the values he represented. And sometimes that meant speaking up, even if it meant breaking the silence he had sworn to maintain. Halloween had arrived, and the palace grounds buzzed with an unusual energy. Families dressed in costumes wandered through the area, their laughter mingling with the crisp autumn air. Ghosts, superheroes, and cartoon characters paraded past the stoic king's guards, who remained as unmoving as ever. For Corporal James Alden, this day was always a mix of amusement and frustration. While some visitors admired the guards' discipline, others saw the occasion as an opportunity to test their limits, and today would prove no different. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, a group of clowns appeared. Their oversized shoes squeaked with every step, and their brightly colored wigs bobbed as they approached the line of guards. They were loud, boisterous, and clearly enjoying themselves. At first, they simply posed for photos near the barriers, striking exaggerated poses that made onlookers chuckle. But it soon became clear that their antics weren't going to stop there. One clown, taller than the rest and wearing a garish rainbow wig, stepped forward. With a dramatic flourish, he saluted James, his hand sweeping upward in a mockery of military precision. His friends erupted into giggles, egging him on. Another clown joined in, mimicking James' rigid stance and pretending to hold an invisible rifle. The crowd around them grew larger, drawn by the spectacle unfolding before their eyes. James tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the horizon ahead. He reminded himself that reacting would only encourage more foolishness. But the clowns weren't content to leave it at that. One of them pulled out a red foam nose and held it up to James' face, attempting to place it on his helmet. The absurdity of the situation gnawed at James' patience. How could anyone think this was acceptable? His jaw tightened as he stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge their behavior. Yet the clowns persisted, growing bolder with each passing moment. When one of them blew a loud raspberry directly in front of him, James felt something inside him snap. All the pent-up frustration from weeks of enduring disrespectful tourists boiled over in an instant. With a deep breath, James leaned forward ever so slightly, his voice booming like thunder. "This is not a circus. Show some respect or leave." The words echoed across the square, silencing the crowd immediately. The clowns froze mid-gesture, their grins vanishing as they realized the gravity of the situation. Tourists gasped, some covering their mouths in surprise, while others nodded approvingly, murmuring about how the guard had every right to speak up. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, slowly, the clowns backed away, their earlier bravado replaced by sheepish expressions. One of them muttered a quiet apology before shuffling off with his group, leaving behind a trail of awkward silence. As the crowd dispersed, several people approached James to thank him for standing his ground. A young woman even handed him a small bouquet of flowers, saying, "We're sorry for what happened. You deserve respect." Though James returned to his position without another word, the incident lingered in his mind. It wasn't just about the clowns. It was about the constant challenge of maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect. Each encounter chipped away at his patience, forcing him to confront emotions he usually kept buried beneath layers of discipline. That evening, as James reflected on the day's events, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. Speaking up hadn't been easy, but it had reminded him of why he chose this path in the first place. Being a king's guard wasn't just about standing still. It was about preserving the integrity of tradition, even if it meant raising his voice to defend it. And though he knew more challenges lay ahead, he also knew that he wouldn't back down. After all, respect wasn't given freely. Sometimes it had to be demanded. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and the palace grounds were alive with music. A viral trend had taken over social media, people challenging strangers to impromptu dance-offs. And today, it seemed, the king's guards were not immune to the craze. Corporal James Alden stood tall in his usual spot, his posture as rigid as ever, but the growing crowd around him buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread quickly that someone was about to attempt the unthinkable, challenging a guard to a dance battle. The instigator was a young man dressed in flashy streetwear, complete with neon sneakers and a backward cap. He swaggered toward James, his movements exaggerated as he began to move rhythmically, throwing shapes that drew cheers from the onlookers. At first, James ignored him, keeping his gaze fixed ahead as though nothing unusual was happening. But the dancer wasn't deterred. If anything, the lack of reaction only fueled his determination to provoke a response. With a confident grin, the man stepped closer, spinning dramatically in front of James and even attempting to mimic the guard's stiff stance with mocking precision. The crowd roared with laughter, egging him on as he added more flair to his routine. Some tourists joined in, clapping along to an invisible beat, while others recorded videos, eager to capture the moment for their feeds. James felt a familiar tension building inside him. He had dealt with countless provocations before, but this was different. The dancer wasn't just poking fun at him. He was turning the sacred duty of a king's guard into a sideshow act. Every twist, every jump, and every laugh from the crowd chipped away at James' resolve. He clenched his fists tightly around his rifle, his knuckles whitening beneath his gloves. When the man dropped to the ground and started break-dancing mere inches from James' boots, something inside him snapped. The disrespect was too much to bear. With a sharp intake of breath, James leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Turn off that infernal racket and behave yourself," he bellowed, his words ringing out across the square. The dancer froze mid-spin, his hands planted firmly on the ground as he stared up at James in stunned silence. For a moment, the entire crowd went quiet, the only sound being the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, slowly, the man climbed to his feet, his earlier bravado replaced by embarrassment. Mumbling a quick apology, he backed away, disappearing into the throng of spectators. As the music faded and the crowd dispersed, James straightened himself, returning to his original position. Though his outburst had been brief, it left a lasting impression, not just on the audience, but on James himself. Speaking up hadn't come naturally to him. Years of training had drilled into him the importance of remaining silent and composed. Yet, in that moment, he realized that staying silent would have meant letting the mockery continue unchecked. Tourists lingered nearby, whispering among themselves. Some nodded approvingly, clearly agreeing that the guard had every right to put a stop to the antics. Others approached James to thank him, their voices filled with admiration for his courage to stand up for himself and for the dignity of his role. One elderly woman patted his arm gently, saying, "You did the right thing, young man. People need to remember what you represent." That evening, as James reflected on the day's events, he couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and exhaustion. Each challenge brought new frustrations, but they also reminded him why he chose this path. Being a king's guard wasn't just about standing still, it was about protecting respect, tradition, and the values he held dear. And sometimes that meant stepping out of character to remind others of the boundaries they had crossed. Though he knew there would be more moments like this in the future, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a statue or a symbol. He was a guardian of history, tasked with ensuring that the dignity of his role remained intact, even if it meant raising his voice to defend it. It was a crisp morning, and the palace grounds were bathed in soft sunlight. Corporal James Alden stood in his usual spot, his polished boots gleaming and his uniform immaculate. The air carried a sense of calm, but James knew from experience that this tranquility wouldn't last long. Sure enough, within minutes, the first wave of tourists began to arrive, their cameras clicking and voices buzzing with excitement. Among them was a man who seemed determined to push boundaries, armed with nothing more than a selfie stick and an unshakable confidence. The man was tall and lanky, wearing sunglasses despite the early hour, and carried himself with an air of carelessness. He wandered close to James, holding his phone high above the crowd to capture the perfect shot. At first, he kept a respectful distance, snapping photos from afar. But as the minutes passed, he grew bolder, inching closer until his selfie stick hovered dangerously near James' face. Each time James shifted slightly to avoid the intrusion, the man adjusted his position, refusing to back down. James felt a flicker of irritation spark inside him. He had dealt with selfie sticks countless times before, but something about this particular tourist felt different. There was an arrogance in the way the man ignored the barriers and disregarded the unwritten rules of respect. When the selfie stick came so close that it nearly brushed against James' helmet, he clenched his jaw tightly, fighting the urge to react. But the man wasn't done yet. With a smirk, he leaned in even closer, angling his phone for a better shot. "Hey, buddy," he said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Can you smile for the camera? Or are you not allowed to have fun?" His friends, standing nearby, burst into laughter, clearly enjoying the spectacle. James remained silent, though his patience was wearing thin. When the man persisted, waving the selfie stick inches from James' nose, James finally spoke up. In a low, controlled tone, he said, "Sir, please step back immediately." The words were firm but measured, designed to command respect without causing a scene. To James' frustration, the man only laughed louder, replying, "What are you going to do about it?" That casual dismissal ignited a fire within James. For years, he had endured countless provocations, always choosing restraint over reaction. But this moment felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about preserving the dignity of the role he represented. Summoning every ounce of authority in his voice, James leaned forward slightly and growled, "I can have you arrested for harassment." The effect was immediate. The man's smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed panic. He stumbled backward, stammering an apology as security officers quickly intervened. The crowd, which had been watching intently, erupted into applause, clearly impressed by James' bold response. Some people even cheered, shouting words of encouragement like, "Good job," and "You tell him." As the situation de-escalated and the man was escorted away, James returned to his position, his expression once again unreadable. Though his outburst had been brief, it left a lasting impression, not just on the audience, but on James himself. Speaking up hadn't come easily, but it reminded him of the power of setting boundaries. Respect wasn't something to be taken for granted. Sometimes it had to be demanded. Later that day, as James reflected on the incident, he couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and relief. Each challenge tested his resolve, but they also reinforced why he chose this path. Being the King's Guard wasn't just about standing still, it was about protecting the values and traditions he believed in. And while moments like these were exhausting, they also reminded him that his role mattered. He wasn't just a statue or a photo opportunity. He was a guardian of history, tasked with ensuring that the dignity of his position remained intact, even if it meant confronting those who crossed the line. Though he knew there would be more encounters like this in the future, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every test of patience brought new lessons, and every act of defiance strengthened his commitment to his duty. After all, respect wasn't given freely. It was earned, one boundary at a time. Months had passed since Corporal James Alden's first outburst, and the stories of his encounters with unruly tourists had spread far and wide. Some called him the guard who roared, while others simply admired his ability to balance discipline with moments of boldness. Though he still stood tall outside the palace gates, his reputation now preceded him. Tourists approached with a mix of curiosity and caution, knowing that this particular guard wasn't someone to be trifled with. On his final shift before retirement, James felt a bittersweet tug in his chest. The years had flown by in a blur of ceremonies, parades, and countless hours spent standing motionless under the sun or rain. He had endured challenges that tested not only his patience, but also his faith in humanity. Yet through it all, he had remained steadfast, upholding the dignity of the uniform and the traditions it represented. Today, however, would be different. As the morning crowd gathered, James noticed a little girl clutching her mother's hand as she stared up at him. She couldn't have been more than 6, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the sight of the towering guard. Her innocence stood out amidst the sea of cameras and chatter. Slowly, she broke free from her mother's grip and approached the barrier separating the tourists from the guards. James watched her carefully, unsure of what to expect. Would she poke his helmet like so many others had done, or try to climb over the fence? Instead, the girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With a shy smile, she held it up toward him. Curious, James stepped forward slightly, lowering himself just enough to take the drawing from her tiny hands. Unfolding the paper revealed a colorful picture of a king's guard standing proudly in front of the palace. Beneath it, written in wobbly letters, were the words, "Thank you." James felt a lump rise in his throat. For years, he had wondered if anyone truly understood the weight of his role, if they saw him as more than just a silent figure in red and gold. This simple gesture told him everything he needed to know. Tears welled up in his eyes as he looked down at the girl. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice breaking ever so slightly. The crowd around them paused, watching the tender moment unfold. Some snapped photos, while others simply smiled, moved by the exchange. It was a stark contrast to the chaos James had faced in the past, a reminder that kindness often outweighed cruelty. Later that afternoon, as James prepared to leave his post for the last time, he reflected on his journey. There had been moments of frustration, anger, and doubt, but there had also been moments of joy, gratitude, and connection. Each encounter, whether challenging or heartwarming, had shaped him into the person he was today. Though he was stepping away from the uniform, James knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. Patience, resilience, and respect weren't just qualities of a king's guard. They were values that transcended any single role. And while he wouldn't miss the sticky fingers, mocking antics, or careless behavior of some tourists, he would miss the sense of purpose that came with protecting something greater than himself. As he walked away from the palace gates for the final time, James glanced back one last time. The golden spires gleamed in the fading sunlight, and a line of guards stood tall, ready to carry the torch forward. He allowed himself a small smile, knowing that he had done his part to uphold the legacy of the King's Guard. In the end, James realized that being the guard wasn't just about maintaining composure or enforcing rules. It was about fostering respect, preserving tradition, and reminding people of the beauty and discipline. And though his days of standing watch were over, his impact would live on, not just in the stories shared by tourists, but in the hearts of those who remembered the man behind the helmet.